The radio message from U-boat headquarters crackled through the underwater static. May 24, 1943, every commander in the North Atlantic received the same order. Surface immediately. Read this communication. Captain Lieutenant Venahanka brought U-515 to periscope depth first, then surfaced cautiously into the grey Atlantic dawn around him across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Other submarines were doing the same. They had been the hunters for nearly 4 years. They had sent thousands of Allied ships to the bottom. But now in the radio room, the message from Grand Admiral Carl Junit was clear. Withdraw from the North Atlantic, effective immediately. For the first time since the war began, Germany was admitting defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic, not because they had run out of submarines, not because they had run out of courage, but because in the space of 31 days, 43 U-boat had been destroyed. Nearly 20% of their operational strength gone. This is the story of Black May, the month that changed naval warfare forever. What happened in May 1943? What weapon had the Allies deployed that could reach into the mid-Atlantic, the Black Pit, where no land-based aircraft could fly? What had turned the hunters into the hunted? The answer was simple and terrifying. The Allies had brought the airfield to the ocean. Act 1, The Happy Times. To understand Black May, we must go back 3 years to a time when German U-boat commanders called their work Gluck. The first happy time began in July 1940. France had fallen. Germany now controlled Atlantic ports like Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. Suddenly, U-boat did not need to waste weeks sailing around Scotland. They could strike from French harbours, reaching the vital shipping lanes in days instead of weeks. Otto Kretschmer in U-99. Garapin in U-47, Joachim Schepke in U-100. These names became legends. Together, these commanders and their fellow U-boat aces sank over 300 Allied ships in 6 months, 1.5 million tons sent to the ocean floor. They attacked at night on the surface, their low silhouettes invisible against the dark water, while merchant ships stood outlined against the moonlit sky. The British called it catastrophic. The Germans called it target practice. Kretschmer developed a tactic so bold it seemed like contempt for the enemy. He would surface, cruise directly into the middle of a convoy, fire torpedoes at point-blank range, then motor calmly out the other side while explosions lit up the night behind him. The escorts never saw him, but the first happy time ended. By May 1941, the British had improved their convoy tactics. They had better radar, more escorts, and in March of 1941 both Kretschmer and Schepke were killed. Pin lost with all hands. The advantage had shifted. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, America entered the war, and Karl Donat saw an opportunity that made him smile. The Americans, he realized, were unprepared. Their eastern seaboard had virtually no defenses, no convoy system, no blackouts in coastal cities. Ships sailed alone, fully lit against the glow of New York and Miami. It was the first happy time all over again, only better. In January 1942, Donuts launched Operation Drumbeat. Beginning with just 5 boats, the operation eventually deployed 16 U-boat along the American coast and Caribbean over 8 months. The slaughter was extraordinary. They sank over 600 ships, 3.1 million tons. American merchant sailors called it the second happy time. Though there was nothing happy about it for the men drowning in burning oil off the coast of North Carolina, and Germany lost only 22 U-boat in return. 22. The exchange rate was staggering. By the spring of 1943, Junitz had reached the peak of his power. He commanded 240 operational U-boat. 118 were at sea at any given moment. The wolf packs were larger than ever, more coordinated, more deadly. But Junitz's confidence masked a fatal vulnerability, one that would soon destroy him. It was located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Act 2, the Black Pit. The Allies called it the Mid-Atlantic Gap. German submariners called it the Black Pit. For U-boat commanders, it was heaven. It was a region of ocean roughly 600 m wide, nearly 1,000 km, centered south of Greenland, too far from Britain for Royal Air Force Coastal Command aircraft to reach. Too far from Newfoundland for Canadian planes, too far from Iceland, though a handful of very long-range liberators operated from there. In the Black Pit, U-boat could surface and run at full speed, 17 knots compared to 7 knots submerged. They could charge their batteries in daylight. They could trail convoys for days, radioing position reports back to Donut's headquarters in occupied France, coordinating wolf-pack attacks. And there was nothing the Allies could do about it. From the air, convoy escorts fought valiantly. Destroyers and corvettes circled the merchant ships like sheepdogs protecting a flock, but there were never enough escorts, and once a wolf pack gathered, once 15 or 20 U-boat began their coordinated night attacks, the mathematics became brutal. The escorts could only be in one place at a time. In March 1943, the U-boat reached their crescendo. They sank 82 ships in the Atlantic alone, 120 worldwide. In a single 10-day period in March, 40 merchant ships went to the bottom. Winston Churchill, who rarely admitted fear, later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. If the hemorrhaging of ships continued, Britain would starve. There could be no invasion of Europe, no D-Day, the war might be lost. Not on a battlefield, but in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Something had to change. Black Pit had to be closed. But how do you put an airfield in the middle of the ocean? The Black Pit was Germany's last advantage. The Allies were about to take it away. The answer was being built in shipyards across America. Small, slow, unglamorous. Sailors called them jeep carriers or baby flat tops. The official designation CVE Escort Carrier. The men joked it stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. But these ugly little ships were about to change naval warfare forever. And German U-boat commanders were about to experience something they had never faced before. Terror from above, anywhere, anytime with nowhere to hide. Act 3. The new weapon SS Bog entered service in the North Atlantic in March 1943. She was small for a carrier, less than 500 ft long, converted from a merchant ship hull. Her top speed was barely 19 knots. She carried perhaps 20 aircraft, Grumman Wildcat fighters, and Avenger torpedo bombers. She looked insignificant compared to the mighty fleet carriers serving in the Pacific, but she had one capability no land-based aircraft possessed. She could go anywhere a convoy went and stay there. On March 5th, Bog departed Argentia, Newfoundland, escorting her first convoy. The U-boat was still out there, still hunting, but now they were the ones being hunted. Captain Jules Short and his pilots spent weeks learning their new trade. Finding a submarine in the Atlantic was like chasing ghosts across an endless sea, but they had new tools. Radio direction finders, the sailors nicknamed Huff Duff, could detect U-boat transmissions and point toward the source. Improved radar could spot a surface submarine's conning tower 10 miles away. And they had one more weapon, brand new, top secret. The Mark 24 mine, that is what they called it. But it was not a mine. It was an acoustic homing torpedo Sunamud fur. You dropped it near a submerged U-boat, and it listened for the sound of diesel engines or propellers. Then it hunted on its own. The U-boat commanders had no idea this weapon existed. On May 21, 1943, Bug was escorting Conv 184 westbound when her aircraft spotted a surfaced U-boat 60 miles ahead, U-231. An Avenger pushed into a shallow dive. 4 depth bombs tumbled toward the conning tower as she crash-dived. The bridge was wrecked. The boat barely made it back to France. The next day, Bog's aircraft made 5 separate attacks against different submarines. U-305 was damaged. U-569 was hit so badly her crew scuttled her themselves rather than let her sink slowly. But Bug was not alone anymore. USS Card arrived. USS Core, USS Croton. Maury were coming every month from American shipyards, and they were not just escorting convoys anymore. They were forming hunter-killer groups, a new type of naval formation. One small carrier with 4 or 5 destroyer escorts roaming the Atlantic, actively searching for U-boat to kill. The U-boats started dying faster than Germany could build them, and in the cramped, claustrophobic steel tubes beneath the waves, the German submariners began to understand what Allied merchant sailors had felt for 3 years. The ocean was not safe anymore. Nowhere was safe. By late April, everything was in place. The carriers were at sea, the aircraft were ready. The U-boat had no idea what was coming. Black May. The first days of May 1943 brought no hint of the catastrophe to come. Zulfpaks still prowled the convoy routes. They still scored kills. Conv ONS-5 lost 13 merchant ships in early May, but the Germans lost 6 U-boat in return. That exchange rate was new and troubling. Then the aircraft came everywhere all the time. The escort carriers USS Bug and USS Card were at sea with their hunter-killer groups. Around 40 very long-range liberators were finally covering the entire mid-Atlantic gap. It was barely enough, but it was enough. The Black Pit was beginning to close, and the U-boat suddenly had nowhere to run. If they stayed on the surface to maintain speed, aircraft found them. If they dove, they were slow, nearly blind, and destroyers could track them with sonar. If they surfaced to charge batteries, radar-equipped planes appeared as if from nowhere. Desperate now, U-boat commanders tried everything. They experimented with staying on the surface and fighting back with anti-aircraft guns. Flakbutts, they called them, U-boat bristling with extra guns. The idea was to shoot it out with attacking aircraft rather than diving. It was suicide. In the first encounter with one of these flak boats, the Allies were surprised. After that, they simply used more aircraft in each attack. The flak buttets died just as quickly as conventional U-boat. They tried traveling in groups for mutual protection. The aircraft attacked anyway. They tried operating at night, but the Allies had lee lights, powerful searchlights paired with radar that could illuminate a submarine in its final moments before depth charges fell. May 4th, May 7th, May 9th. Every day brought new losses. U-176, U-192, U-447, U-266. Names called out at Dunut's headquarters, each representing 50 men, most of them dead. U-528's final radio transmission was cut off mid-sentence. 54 men gone, some U-boat simply vanished. Cause unknown. One moment, radioing position reports, then silence. The casualty list grew longer. Experienced commanders were dying. The men who had survived the happy times, who knew every trick, every evasion. They were being replaced by younger officers, some with only months of training, and they were dying even faster. On May 12th, U-456 was attacked by a British Halifax bomber. On May 13th, U-657 was sunk by a Lee Light Wellington. May 15th, U-463 destroyed by an Australian Sunderland. The German submariners began to wonder if any patrol would end with a return to port. By mid-May, the crisis was obvious to everyone at U-boat headquarters. In just 2 weeks, more U-boat had been lost than in any 3-month period of the war. The mathematics were brutal: 40 U-boat lost. Barely 24 Allied ships sunk in return. The exchange rate had reversed completely. For every merchant ship sunk, nearly 2 U-boat were destroyed. On May 19th, 2 Royal Navy destroyers sank, U-954. Among the dead, Dunut's son, Peter. The admiral continued directing operations even as he mourned. Act 5, Withdrawal. May 24, 1943, Karl Dunutz made the hardest decision of his naval career. He ordered the U-boat to withdraw from the North Atlantic, not temporarily, not to regroup, but in admission of defeat. In his message to commanders, he was blunt. The enemy's location instruments were superior. Their aircraft could now surprise U-boat anywhere. He understood exactly what had beaten him. The escort carriers, the improved radar, the aircraft that could now reach anywhere in the Atlantic. The U-boat would return to the North Atlantic later in 1943. They would sink more ships. The battle would continue until the last week of the war, but they never regained the advantage. Black May was the turning point, the moment when the Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies. The final tally for May 1943 was catastrophic for Germany. 43 U-boat destroyed, nearly 20% of operational strength gone in 31 days. 18 boats lost to convoy escorts and carrier aircraft. 14 lost to air patrols. 6 destroyed in the Bay of Biscay as they attempted to leave or return to their bases. 4 lost to accidents or unknown causes. It was more U-boat than had been lost in the entire year of 1941. It was nearly 3 times the worst previous month. And most horrifying for the submariners, the loss of experienced officers and trained crew who represented the next generation of commanders. For German U-boat men, May 1943 would be forever remembered as Schwarzsommer Black May closing. But what did the U-boat commanders themselves say? What were their honest reactions to this new weapon? The historical record is fragmentary. Most commanders who faced the escort carriers never returned to write their stories. Those who did survive often wrote years later. Their accounts culminated by time and defeat, but certain truths emerge from their testimonies and from the raw operational records. First, surprise. The U-boat service had been told that small escort carriers existed, but they had not grasped the implications. Aircraft at sea were supposed to be fleet carriers, fast, powerful ships that escorted battle groups, not merchant convoys. The idea that small, slow carriers would be assigned to protect trade routes, that they would roam the ocean, actively hunting submarines, was unexpected. Second, frustration. Many commanders reported spotting aircraft and diving, only to have destroyers appear overhead within minutes, dropping depth charges. The coordination between air and surface forces was something new. The submarine might escape the aircraft, but it could not escape the destroyers that followed. Third, fear. That is the word that appears most often in post-war interviews and memoirs, not shame at admitting fear. These were men who had faced depth charges, convoy escorts, and the constant threat of death in a steel coffin beneath the waves. But the aircraft represented something different. A U-boat on the surface was nearly blind. The first indication of an aircraft attack might be the roar of engines seconds before depth charges fell. There was no time to react, no time to fight back effectively. One German officer later wrote that aircraft appearing in the mid-Atlantic, where they should have been safe, felt like the rules had changed without warning. Another described the growing realization through May that nowhere was safe anymore. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. U-boat crews had always known danger, but they had also known there were sanctuaries. The mid-Atlantic, where no aircraft could reach, the night when they could surface safely. The open ocean, where a submarine could disappear into 3 dimensions of empty water. Black May destroyed that certainty. The escort carriers brought the threat of air attack everywhere. The improved radar made night operations suicidal. The acoustic torpedoes, when crews eventually learned of their existence, meant that even diving deep and running silent offered no guarantee of survival. Historians would later describe the U-boat as clay pigeons for target practice. The Battle of the Atlantic continued for another 2 years. U-boats sank more ships. Allied convoys still fought their way across the cold waters, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The escort carriers, those small, ugly, unglamorous ships that sailors joked about, had closed the air gap. They had brought the battle to the middle of the ocean, and in doing so, they had defeated the greatest submarine force the world had ever seen. By war's end, American escort carriers in the Atlantic had sunk or helped sink 53 U-boat. British and Canadian escort carriers accounted for dozens more. The USS Bog alone, that first carrier to prove the concept, sank 13 enemy submarines. But for every U-boat that died, there were merchant sailors who made it home. Convoys that reached Britain, lives saved. The cost in human life was staggering. Of the 40,000 German submariners who served in U-boat during the war, 30,000 died, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any German service. Many of those men died in May 1943 or in the months that followed, when a U-boat patrol became almost certainly fatal. The escort carriers also protected thousands of merchant ships that otherwise would have been sunk. Every ship that reached Britain carried food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft, the material that would make D-Day possible, that would keep Britain in the war, that would eventually bring victory. The U-boat commanders who survived never forgot Black May. It was the month when the hunters became the hunted. When the ocean, which had been their domain, their element, became a trap, when they learned what Allied merchant sailors had learned 3 years earlier, that there is no safety at sea, only the hope of reaching port before your luck runs out. The escort carriers proved a simple truth. You do not need a massive fleet carrier to control the sea. You do not need fighters and dive bombers capable of attacking enemy task forces. Sometimes all you need is a small ship, a few aircraft, and the ability to be there in the middle of the ocean when and where the enemy least expects you. In May 1943, that combination changed the course of the war. And for 43 U-boat crews who slipped beneath the waves that month and never returned, the escort carriers had accomplished what years of convoy battles had failed to achieve. They had ended the U-boat terror.